Hi, I'm Craig. This is part 2 of a series on Darwin's voyage. And before we start on the voyage, I want to talk a little bit about Darwin's life pre-voyage, particularly with regards to his experiences and education relevant to the voyage, his scientific development or his development as a naturalist. And certainly possible knowing where someone ends up to look back over their life and just pick out the details that lead there as if it were inevitable. And without saying that, Darwin's life, or any life, is far from inevitable. But I think most of Darwin's life points in that direction. Early on, he liked gardening. He'd follow the garden around and picked up little bits of plant names and plant types. He loved playing chemist. He revered his older brother, and the two of them spent hours in the shed mixing liquids and powders, making awful smells and expensive kitchenware. They were actually quite deliberate in their processes and taking notes on these things. From a young age, he seems to always have liked sorting things into categories. The passion for collecting, which leads a man to be a systematic naturalist, or virtuoso, or miser, was very strong in me. It'd be pebbles, shells, bird eggs, insects, large collections of all of these. His favorite childhood pastime was tromping through the woods. He learned to ride well, started with a pony, and later on his voyage, he would ride for hundreds of miles in a stretch, across South America. And during this time also, he, as a child, learned to shoot well, pigeons, partridges, quail. And so then, not infrequently, when in South America, he was just living off of whatever he could shoot. Ostriches, I guess technically rhea, armadillo, taco, that's a large rodent named for the sound they make. And a lot of his shooting also contributed to the meat that the crew ate. Later in childhood, after his mother died, he went to a boarding school, had a classical emphasis, lots of Greek and Latin. Nothing there stimulated him. His first 2 years of university were at Edinburgh in Scotland. It was a great medical school at the time. He went up there with his older brother who was studying to be a doctor as well. But like I said, it wasn't long before the surgery theater convinced Darwin that he could never stomach that kind of thing. But he did continue to make regular hospital rounds. He had done something similarly with his father the summer before, and half-heartedly, somewhat haphazardly attended classes. Dissection, anatomy, midwifery, nutrition, pharmacy. He did like his chemistry class, reminiscent of his childhood love. And he took one natural history class, and his book is very marked up. It was an exceptionally comprehensive, with a specific focus on geology. But not only did it not catch his interest, he found it boring and vowed not to take another geology class. So his natural history learning was almost entirely extracurricular. And as a minor example, his lodgings were right next to the Edinburgh Museum, and he particularly liked going there to talk to the curator of the museum, of the natural history collection. Another minor example, he took taxidermy lessons. Every day for a couple months. Taxidermy is stuffing dead animals, their skins, a unique hobby. Less Norman Bates than it might initially sound. There's no photography, obviously, in the day. So a museum stuffed specimens were really the only way that people had of seeing animals that weren't in their immediate environment. And serendipitously, Darwin's stuffing skills were a big help during the voyage. During the voyage, he stuffed literally hundreds of skins, most importantly being the Galapagos birds, and he's sending these back to England. But by far, his greatest love during the Edinburgh years was exploring the seashore. The university was almost right on the water, so 15 minutes, he'd go for a long walk along the shore, mess with ever dead stuff, struggling on the beach that the tide had left behind. Sponges, sea slugs, starfish, coral. Darwin's brother was there with him during that first year, and the two of them would often go down together. Sometimes the fishermen would let them pick an oddity from their catches, probably amused that these boys were so amused. And occasionally they were even invited out with the oyster trawlers. And the whole world of weird mollusk invertebrates, that's a very different ecosystem that he had been acquainted with when he was tromping through the forest as a child. So this is a new passion for him. And it was on one of those seaside walks that Darwin made the acquaintance of the man that would become his first mentor, an Edinburgh professor specializing in marine invertebrates. It's like roughly anything in the water that you wouldn't be tempted to call a fish. Darwin never took a class with this man, but countless conversations, occasional dredgings in tide pools, microscope skills. Darwin developed what would turn out to be a pretty good skill set when dealing with these simple organisms. And then later on, while on the voyage, Darwin routinely drug a net behind the ship, so collecting marine life, and those ended up constituting about half of all of Darwin's animal specimens from the voyage. Incidentally, it seems like that would have been common practice, but Darwin's is one of the first recorded uses of this method, and any kind of science like oceanography wasn't a thing then. So this was a new thing that Darwin was getting involved in, and he would also find that the cruise soundings, when you lower a weight down into the water, and the weights would be hollow, and they'd stuff them with wax or animal fat, and then bring up whatever they found on the bottom, marked with longitude, latitude, depth. Darwin found that extremely fascinating. You have a random sample of the organisms specific to the environment with which they were found. Later in life, Darwin would undertake an in-depth 8-year research program to become literally the world expert on barnacles. He was especially fascinated with the massive variation that he found among barnacles. A lot of them are hermaphroditic, massive differences in size, even sometimes between males and females of the same species. We'll see later why variation is so important. And he honed his chops for classifying taxonomically. And his extracurricular introduction to marine biology at his first university of Edinburgh had a kind of parallel at his second university, Cambridge. Darwin found another mentor there with another passion, and also a passion that Darwin would also continue later in life, plants, botany. And similarly to Darwin's continued interest in marine invertebrates, both on the voyage and later in life, Darwin would also nurture a lifelong interest in plants. In his later years, probably not just out of passion, but also because tending greenhouse is a good way to be a scientist that's also conducive to being old and not in great health, studying plants that you're growing. He wrote a bunch of books on peculiar plants, climbing plants, vines, tendrils, sort of a sequel called The Power of Movement in Plants, one on carnivorous plants. And this professor, John Stevens Henslow, will have a huge impact on Darwin. Darwin later in life described their meeting as, quote, "a circumstance which influenced my whole career more than any other." And there's so much evidence of that. He's the one that, in addition to his contagious love of plants, had a contagious love of travel. So even though, sadly, Henslow's own routines allowed him little travel himself, he's the one that recommended Darwin for the Beagle voyage when it came up. He thought about going himself first. When the possibility arose from the Navy, this was more on account of Darwin's enthusiasm, perhaps, than any special expertise that he possessed at the time. But Darwin leapt at the opportunity, and Henslow is also the one who Darwin is sending his specimens back to for safekeeping during the course of the voyage. So Henslow is also the one who showcased some of said specimens with some of Darwin's letters. So he's like building up Darwin's name as a pro bono publicist, even while Darwin is away on the voyage. Henslow is also the one who introduces Darwin to his own mentor and arranges for Darwin get his first smattering of in-the-field geologizing that will prove so valuable later when he's on the voyage. More on that in a second. There's also one more overarching way that I think Henslow had a big impact on Darwin. Henslow was devoutly religious, and Reverend Henslow actually, and almost all teachers at Cambridge were reverends at that time, and some large portion, maybe the majority of students who are going to Cambridge are slated to go into the church thereafter. And Darwin had kind of resigned himself to that fate, the idea that he was, I'm going to become a clergyman. That's why he was at Cambridge. But Darwin also loves tromping through the woods and mucking in the tide, and what kind of job is that? And so he sees Henslow as the perfect model of someone that is kind of straddling the love of studying the natural world while still being able to be religious. So Darwin is sort of calculating, if I go into the clergy, that's on Sundays, in particular, and I still have a lot of the week to do whatever in the woods. And in fact, not long after Darwin returns from his voyage, Henslow will leave Cambridge for a country parish, pretty much of the type that Darwin was anticipating he would end up at himself. So there's a pretty close parallel between how they're viewing their situation. Now, Henslow's own mentor that I mentioned before, Adam Sedgwick, Reverend Sedgwick, and Sedgwick, totally apart from Darwin, is known today, at least among geologists, as a geologist of significant stature. He had been serving as the president of the Geological Society of London, and Sedgwick takes Darwin on a 2-week geological excursion, just the two of them, during which Darwin gets first-hand experience with geological fieldwork and really falls in love with that. So we'll see a lot of Darwin's geologizing during the voyage. And in fact, Darwin's first 3 books after he returns from the voyage and after his travel memoir are all on aspects of geology. First on coral reefs, then on volcanic islands, and the third on the geology of South America, particularly the Andes. And this now brings us right up to the start of our voyage, because it's upon arriving back home after his excursion with Sedgwick that he finds a letter waiting for him. The letter inquiring, might you be interested in accompanying a British naval vessel to do observing and collecting on an extended voyage to South America?